suffering in this December. I was born in Argentina, so we'll see what happens next week. But welcome to this 11th, to the first plenary session of the 11th edition of the Atlantic Dialogues. And this particular panel, Compounded Crisis, the wider Atlantic taking stock. So can we allow the panelists in, please? We may? No, there's a voice.
Having a breast malfunction. Shall we remove all of this?
I don't know. There's a lot of this here. Do you have one?
Yeah.
Wait. Do you need it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
I mean, what a year. Well, 3 years since we were here in Marrakesh last. Back in December 2019, if I'm not mistaken, who would have thought that we were to face the first global pandemic in over, 100 years? Another war in Europe with global repercussions, inflation spiraling across many parts of the world. And again, as an Argentine myself, I know what I'm talking about we have an 11% running inflation right now. To discuss this and many other issues that are affecting both sides of the Atlantic, we have a great panel with Olga Secretary of the Human Capital Africa, Frédéric Berhage for the World Bank, Thomas Gomard for the French Institute of International Affairs, and Andrés Rosenthal of the Mexican Council on Foreign Relations.
I have enthusiastic people at the side of the room.
Well, Ottaviano is there. Obviously, we're going to be enthusiastic there. Thank you to the panelists for being here. I'm going to open the floor to questions on the very last 15 minutes of the panel. So please use your app to send questions, and then they will be filtered and funneled through me. And I may also break the session to use one of the funky word cloud apps that we have, word cloud activities we have on the app. So please engage, use your phones, although try to listen as well. But again, as said, I mean, the world is in turmoil. All of you who are here know that, probably better than I do. But my job often makes me to go to the center of such turmoils. I was in Ukraine covering the war. I cover a massive drought that is spurring a famine in the Horn of Africa, brewing conflicts between Congo and Rwanda. I mean, whatever is happening between Russia and Ukraine now is having massive global consequences, including Russia's growing influence in Africa. Let's look at this more globally. The multilateral system as we know it is being heavily challenged with any threat, going from climate change to nuclear war. Many are even looking at China with concern. After Russia invaded Ukraine, will China try to do the same with Taiwan? Is the US the superpower that it once was? Obi, Frédéric, Thomas, and Andrés, let me start with the same question to all of you. You've been around for long, you have experience. How safe do you feel these days? And what is the crisis that truly keeps you awake at night? Obi, do you want to start?
I certainly feel safer than more than the over 400 million of Africans that are without access to the privileges that I have. So I really do think that the most important thing that should worry should worry all of us as the privileged elite of society globally is that the world has become even more brittle. The fact that the necessary resilience of systems that come from having equitable growth, equal opportunities is farther away from us than even before the pandemic. The pandemic should worry us. I would say that much more poverty in the world, more entrenched inequality, and still an irresponsible political class around our world failing to take responsibility for the issues that were already there, because what the pandemic did was to bring into sharper focus for us all the fragilities that we refused to confront. So they became clearer, and even then, we still are not boldly collaborating and cooperating to tackle these challenges. In summary, I would say that the pandemic came to give us an opportunity to confront our demons. And if we don't do that, then I don't know what else we're going to plan to do. Because as you know, Andre, in the global risks before 2019, health pandemic wasn't one of the top 10. So what is it that our failure could be brewing that we're not even aware of? That's where the sense of not feeling safe then includes all of us. Because when you talk poverty, when you talk inequality, we're in the upper class of this, so we don't know that much of it. But we saw the health pandemic, the result of not paying attention to the things that were important. And it came after all of us.
Thank you. I think that was a key point, that one of the things the pandemic showed is that we are all linked into a sort of chain of humanity that affects us all. Farid, what keeps you awake at night?
I'd like to build on what my former colleague and dear friend Obi just put on the table. The fragilities that we don't want to confront. When one looks at what happened over the last 5, 6, 7 years, we see that issues related to health, for instance. We had the first warning with Ebola. We had it, we saw it. And we tried to manage it, but at the end of the day, when the Ebola went away, we went away. Then we had COVID. It came out of nowhere, and it found health services that were totally unprepared. Even in places where we thought, that health services would be kind of okay, kind of able to manage. No, they were overwhelmed, and we found ourselves in a situation where, hundreds of thousands, millions of people became vulnerable. So this is one issue. But then we can go beyond that and look at the fragility around the world. Now we are talking about climate change. Climate is the big issue that everybody is talking about, and rightfully so. What have we done over the last 5, 10, 15, 20 years? Frankly, nothing much but talk. Nothing much but talk. And when I look at the outcome of COP27, one, cannot just be hopeful, because things are happening and the decision makers are not making the right decisions. Possibly because they're politicians and because they see their future, as meaning tomorrow.
Or we call them irresponsible.
And this is where international institutions become very important. This is where the World Bank, the UN, and others become absolutely important, because those institutions have in their mandate, have the capacity to look beyond tomorrow, have the capacity to look beyond next year, and have the capacity through their analytical work to put on the table and to suggest to the real decision makers, ways forward. I look at the region that I am in charge of, from Morocco to Iran. Each one of the countries there, each one of those countries is today in a very, very heavy water stress. Each one of those. I was in Iraq yesterday. Before that, I was in Jordan. And I was in Yemen. And I can go on and on. And I was in Morocco about 2 or 3 weeks ago. Everybody's talking about that. Water is an issue. What are we really doing about it? I'm not sure we are doing enough. I'm not sure we are doing enough. And this is really where we all need to be extremely careful. Because what's hitting us today, it's not that we don't see it coming. We see it coming, but we're not acting as much as we should be acting. One last point that I'd like to make relating to the need for more cooperation between the countries. You mentioned the wider Atlantic. I would look at all the countries in the Middle East and North Africa as part of this wider Atlantic. And going back to water, every single waterway in our region is an international waterway, every single one. So there is a need there, absolutely fundamental, to make sure that there are, there is engagement through, international cooperation with the help of the UN, the World Bank, and others to try to unlock some of those problems that we see. Well, as I said, I was in Iraq yesterday. The main issue in Iraq is water now, and the main issue is that water is coming either from Turkey or coming from Iran. And there is no international cooperation there. Look at Egypt and GERD and the issue with Ethiopia. And I can go on and on. So there is really a need for decision makers to have a prospective view of what's happening. And again, I don't want to be blowing my own horn, but institutions like the World Bank can actually play that role of addressing the issue, raising the flag, and showing the way to move forward and to address those challenges.
Thank you, Fred. Thomas?
Andreas, before responding, allow me to thank the PCNS for its invitation and also to thank Karim for his tact, because I think it's more comfortable for a French speaker to speak today than tomorrow. So my best wishes to both teams. Now, coming back to your very fundamental question, to be honest, I feel myself safer by comparison with my grandparents or with my parents, for instance, regarding the level of political violence they had to deal with. If I ask the question, is my son will be safer than I am, it's another issue, because I think that he will have to deal with two things: the comeback of political violence on the European continent, which is something, as discussed during the initial session, unexpected at this level of violence. And of course, he will have, and we should deal with global challenges, with two big trends converging, in my opinion. The very first one is the acceleration of the environmental degradation with the climate, but not only, the loss of biodiversity, the pollutions. And the other trend is the propagation of technologies, which has very good ways, empowerment, personal empowerment, new means, but also which is leading some society under complete control. So that's basically, the framework of analysis, in my way, to have these two trends in mind. So as a think tanker, I try to anticipate, the evolution. I'm very worried, but certainly we will back on that, by the situation in Europe right now because of the war in Ukraine. I understand very well that it's not the epicenter for everyone, for obvious reasons. It was said very clearly during the initial session, but maybe I will be back on that. But I try, in fact, to see the overlap between three types of geopolitics. The very first one, which continued to be very, very pivotal, it is a geopolitics of fossil. Even if we want to decrease in our respective energy mix, the fossil parts, the fact is that it's higher than 80% still. So it will be very difficult to reduce, and it will continue to drive many decisions. The second geopolitics, it is the geopolitics of clean energy, which has also some things to be analyzed very precisely and very deeply for all the regions in the world. And the last one is what we could call the geopolitics of data, which is also very difficult to be analyzed. And if you try to anticipate, I think you should start by taking into consideration this three types of geopolitics and to see how they played in the different area.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Andreas, we come from the same travel part of the world. What keeps you awake?
Thank you, and again, let me join my colleagues in thanking the Policy Center for the New South for the invitation to what is, I guess, my 6th Atlantic Dialogue. In 1962, in October of 1962, I was in college in the United States when the Cuban Missile Crisis blew up. And I wrote a letter to my parents, who were living in Egypt at the time, saying goodbye. I honestly was caught up in this hysteria that took place in the US during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And now that I am somewhat older and maybe somewhat wiser, I sleep well, but I do have a whole list of issues which would keep me and others awake. Some of them have already been mentioned, but not all of them. Climate change, water shortage, energy availability, a nuclear threat, once again, the discovery of new fusion technology just this week, food insecurity, pandemics, deforestation and desertification, the movement of people, migration, youth unemployment and youth not able to study, supply chains interrupted. I mean, you could go on and on with a list of issues which I think today bring us closer together because in the wider Atlantic, whether it's in Latin America or in Africa or in Europe or in Asia even, we have the same issues. We look at the same problems that face us. But it's probably one of the periods of history in which we have the most difficulty in dealing with these issues in either a global or a wider Atlantic or even a regional or national level. So I sleep well, but when I wake up every morning, I look at this list of stuff and I say, you know, it's not an easy period. And my children and my grandchildren have to live with it. I would think that we are looking at a period in which, if we are at the end of globalization, and we've replaced globalization in that general definition with a regional focus, Africa and Latin America are today probably more heterogeneous and more difficult to typify and define than any period in history. We have a lack of unity in Latin America, as you know, Andres. You can look at 2 or 3 examples recently: the replacement of the IADB president, the Peruvian crisis of just these last few weeks, and in Europe also looking inward. Ukraine, migration, those are the issues that keep Europeans awake. The US's relationship with Russia and China, where is that going to lead us? Who's going to come out victorious? Who's going to have to ally with one or another? So I can answer your question. I'm sorry to be so long, but I can say that I think all of these issues would be enough to keep me awake if I were younger, and keep all of the ones in this room who are younger awake as well. Thank you.
You're definitely wiser, Andres. Obi, let me go back to you, especially as we're in Africa. And you spoke about a key word. You said resilience. You were referring to Africans. Your own country, Nigeria, is going to face probably quite a tough election next February. A civil war in Ethiopia is morphing into something else after a recent peace deal. the very dangerous tensions between DR Congo and Rwanda. Somalia, because of water issues, as Free was saying, is on the verge of famine. South Africa is in a political turmoil. Jihadists continue to wreak havoc across the Sahel. But Africa is also home to the world's youngest population, some of the world's most promising economies, most exciting startups, millions of hectares of arable land. How do you see Africa? What is going to be Africa's role in this complex turmoil world of today?
Could you get something more complex?
Well, we are here to sort that out.
Okay, so the first thing that I'd like to do is to build a context for the picture that you've painted. And I think that my first context is to say that we do know that economic growth, economic development is an antidote to fragility. And to the extent that we are not achieving that as quickly as we should in poorer segments of our world, to that extent, do we have to live with a sense of instability and the sense of fear of what the future would look like. So now, before we even go to the issues you raised about the continent, I should first say to the world, it is time to begin to grow again. We need economic growth. For as long as the world is not growing as a result of poor economic management that has come from failures of monetary and fiscal policies in more advanced economies, it's going to affect the continent of Africa. Africa needs the world to grow. I mean, the OECD countries need to help work everyone out of the rut that we currently find ourselves in. And we do know that the kinds of poor policy choices that were made as part of that whole program of responding to the economic impact of the pandemic, has not been fully resolved. And that's because the political consensus in various countries, even stronger democracies, to resolve basic economic issues, still lacking, still lacking. I mean, you look around the world today. I didn't want to, sound alarmist, but frankly speaking, we have a vacuum of leadership globally. And that's what we're struggling with. We're struggling with it in Europe. We're struggling with it in the Americas. We're struggling with it in Africa. It's in Asia. I mean, there is a whole political governance issue that is driving the failure to tackle the kinds of problems that beset the weaker, the more vulnerable segments of the global population. So that's my broad context. Now, specific to Africa, you find that Africa's economic growth, I'm not being heard. Are you hearing me?
Yeah.
You're loud and clear.
Okay, maybe they're not hearing me from the newsroom. Okay, so sorry about that. So when you then get closer to Africa's multiple challenges, well, we're back again to the matter of governance. A whole lot of the conflicts on the continent come from a lot of issues around governance. Governing the space at domestic and regional levels, we have a real challenge in that regard. So whether it's a contest for resources, pitching elite across borders against themselves, it's a governance problem. Then we also have the challenge of the conflict resolution mechanisms not having been deepened sufficiently so that we can be more preventive than responding to conflicts when they have already ossified. So we do need to look at these resolution mechanisms and figure out how better to institutionalize these processes of dealing with conflicts. And then the third part of it is that for many of the countries on the continent, they actually had mastered the art of macroeconomic stability. We got relative macroeconomic stability on our continent. From, in those early 2000s until the reckless behavior that happened in European capitals and Wall Street. That reckless behavior that led to the financial crisis and then the economic crisis unraveled Africa's macroeconomic stability, unraveled the growth that was beginning to be a steady 4 to 5% annually. Where Africa was going to go after that was going to be to increase the level of growth, because Africa does need to grow at least 7% annually in order to make a dent on poverty. But we lost that as a result of the reckless behavior of more advanced economies. So that takes me again back to the global, which is that globally, the poor seem to be paying the price of the behaviors of the rich. Why should that be so? Even with the pandemic, for goodness sake, I did utter something where I said that China owed Africa not just an apology, but a payment for what happened to Africa's economic growth. Because with the pandemic, even though it did not affect lives as much as it affected livelihoods on our continent, the truth is that that pandemic could have been better managed, more transparently communicated, and it would have saved the poorer people the kind of impact that it has had on them.
Sorry, but doesn't that apply to climate change as well? Is an Africa paying a price?
So I mean, look, on climate change, we've been saying that when the West are ready to have a proper conversation on climate change, we would get a movement on the COPs that we have had, 17 of them now, right? But the challenge is we know that there are costs and consequences of behaviors, and yet we engage in moral hazards on a frequent pattern. And what I am saying essentially is that this whole concept of a multilateral order that does not sort of pay attention to take responsibility. That's why I called our political actors irresponsible now, because there is a whole take responsibility that's being avoided. It's being avoided at national levels, it's being avoided at regional levels, and it's being avoided at global levels. And, people have become cynical. They actually have become cynical. People just look at these problems and they say, oh, like my dear friend said, he sleeps well, and that it's going to be his children. No, the children are angry at us. Haven't you noticed? The younger generation are very angry. They think we failed them. So frankly speaking, we really shouldn't be sleeping, because, you don't want any child spitting on your grave when you're dead, So we've got to fix what we can fix. It means that we need to be resolved. We need to say to ourselves, what are the things that have failed and what are the things that have worked? I believe in the market. The markets have produced better prosperity for all of us, but we know the limits of the market. And there is a conversation to be had properly in terms of how the market can be made to work even better for the poor. We're avoiding that conversation. So guess what? The ones who are anti-market are gaining greater ascendancy in the public debate around the issues of how do we generate growth, how do we ensure inclusive prosperity, because those who should defend the market by doing the right things have decided to go in the other direction. My final point on this is that, look at what happened to us. How did a world that understood the value of competition turn into a world that deliberately permitted what I call concentrated production system. Was it not? The pandemic showed us the foolishness of what's happened in countries of Europe and America. I mean, you abandoned structural reforms for competitiveness in manufacturing and pretended that those things don't matter anymore. And so everybody made China the warehouse of the world, or the, what do you call it? Yes, the production center of the world. And see the price that people paid as a result of that during the pandemic. Why is it that the world cannot think of regions like Africa as important jurisdictions for the deconcentration of production? Why is it that the definition of risk makes Africa appear to be riskier than it truly is? Because, I mean, with what happened with financial crisis, we saw that Africa is not the riskiest. The risks live in Europe. They live in America. But the African risk is interpreted in a way that massively punishes the idea of diversification. So I want to say clearly that for us, the next steps in our global development has got to be a sense that we must redesign. It is time to redesign the multilateral system that we have. And when I say redesign, I'm not talking about tinkering with it on the margins, because that is a missed opportunity. The pandemic was a wake-up call to our world to boldly confront issues. And you know, when you boldly confront issues, you're not going to be liked by everybody. But we're tired of politicians that want to be liked. We want politicians that see problems and solve problems. Well, if you don't want, that's what I want. And that's what I'm hoping that, you know, we will get in my country, because abdication of responsibility is a luxury that only the privileged can afford. The rest of the people need us to do better. I'm sorry that I am going on this, but you know, frankly speaking, if we gathered at this year's Atlantic Dialogue and we just rehash the same statements, I would feel like I'm fooling myself. You know, do you want to fool yourselves? No, definitely not. So we should be angry enough about problems that we can solve. Is there any problem we cannot solve in the world today? There's hardly any problem we cannot solve. If we all but put our minds to it and decided to say no, enough of this status quo. How can we be wringing our hands and people are still miserably poor in our world today? We already know how growth happens. We know that when you get the sound policies, you build the kind of institutions that enable growth. We know that if you have good policy investment choices, that growth happens. We've seen countries go from poverty to growth. What are we sitting as a privileged class of people and just, you know, taking life easy until we die? What's that? We should do something differently.
Are we?
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Wait, Obi, now that you're here, I'm going to use your brilliance for a second. In Latin America, when there were economic crises, they were usually contagious. What's happening in Ghana is going to spread, or Africa can contain it?
Just look at the drivers of what's happening in Ghana. Massive borrowing. And when you look at the debt crisis and what it could create, the spiral effect that it creates, we have to be careful and not simply say, it's Ghana. And so we do need to get more prudent management of economies. And that is going to depend very much on the multilateral systems and what it forces. You know, countries have to take responsibility. I'm not here saying the world should, you know, take over Africa and help Africa like a nanny. No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm simply saying that two things have to happen together. The world must take its responsibility for when it messes up big time and it affects the poor. And then the countries of Africa must take responsibility for development. Development is local. When we have the kinds of politicians that think that the responsibility to develop Africa belongs to the rest of the world, I have problems with them. And I tell them.
Well, that's a great starting point to try and solve the problems. Thank you, Obi. Fadid, you said something that in a way echoes what Obi said. Did some of these crises caught us off guard because we were not looking or because we didn't want to look? And that applies to Europe today, I think. And I come to you for that because the war in Ukraine has sparked an energy crisis. There's going to be a very tough winter probably in Europe coming, and the winter is only just starting. But with North Africa and the Gulf countries will take advantage of this to make their own energy arrangements with Europe, and will Europe, I mean, it's a double-edged sword, will actually say, okay, this is the time, is it too late? Or is Europe ready to change its matrix to focus on these new partners?
How can I come after Obi?
Well, it's hard for everyone.
Yeah, it is hard for everybody. First, I forgot to thank the center and Karim, by the way. So thank you so very much for organizing this. And Karim is a friend. He's somebody I like so much and I trust so much that I left my cell phone with him today. So just for you to know how much of a trust I have in the man. So let me put some numbers on the table, because of course, what Obi said is absolutely right. But what I'd like to stress is the whole discussion about taking responsibility. It's very important. When I look at the Middle East and North Africa region today, again, from Morocco to Iran, what I'm looking at is that by current demographic trends, we will be having, by 2050, 27 years from now, more than 300 million kids knocking at the door of the job market. 300 million, meaning that this region will have to create 800,000 jobs every single month between now and 2050. Where are these jobs going to come from? Surely not from the public sector. We know that. The public sector in our region is playing an overwhelmingly distortive role. It's all over the place. State-owned enterprises are all over the place, and they are not well managed. Just a couple are well managed. Say, here in this country, OCP, possibly in Saudi Arabia, Aramco, possibly Tangemed. We don't have that many. So there is a need in this part of the world, as it is for a number of other countries, to open more space to the private sector, to have more competition, to make sure that there is that breadth of hope and creativity that is left for the young people to bring about a new dynamic. And for that, of course, again, you need decision making. You need courage. When you put courage and politicians in the same sentence, generally it's a problem.
You see?
Well, you know what? They need to be courageous, because otherwise this place is not going to go anywhere. I'm talking about our region. Yeah. So this is one. Second, you mentioned winners, the Gulf countries. True, there's a windfall of money in those Gulf countries. Countries are sitting on hundreds of billions of dollars. But the issue is that this is not sustained and sustainable. If you have that money, you need to invest it, and you need to invest it right. And you need to make sure that the environment within which you are operating is an environment that is conducive to more growth. If you have your own island sitting on hundreds of trillions of dollars, you're not going to go anywhere. And by the way, there's a pendulum here. Remember, a year and a half, 2 years ago, oil was at an all-time low, and all of these oil-rich countries were in trouble. This year only, Saudi Arabia finally, balanced its budget. They were in trouble over the last, few years. So we should not take for granted, this huge windfall. What we should be doing all over the place, in particular in the Middle East and North Africa, is insisting more on governance, on transparency, on responsibility, and on foresight when it comes to putting together economic policies. And this is what we are all pushing for. I see countries like the one I was in yesterday, I mentioned it again, sitting on trillions of dollars of reserves, having right now in its central bank $100 billion in reserves. They are sitting there. But this country is terribly managed. Terribly managed. We saw a few months ago, and you may have seen it, you know, the hack of the century, $2.5 billion disappearing from God knows where. And politicians trying to find a way around to, you know, bring about some kind of balance. There is a way for all of us, you know, to look at the future with more rational, you know, outlook. And the only way is really to bring about much, you know, a new social contract. And this is something that we have been putting on the table for quite some time. Because the social contract that was working in a number of our countries was basically the state giving to the people everything for almost nothing. And the counterfactual, or the counterpart was, you know, for people not to question too much the politics and the political choices and the policy choices. Well, things have changed dramatically. And we saw that with what was called in a very awkward way, the Arab Spring. We saw countries that were kind of doing okay, that all of a sudden imploded. And with all of the consequences that we see today, whether it is in Tunisia, in Libya, in Lebanon, in Yemen, and I can count. The courage for politicians to take responsibility in opening up their systems to more voice, and opening up their systems to the youth and the creativity of the youth, and to instilling a more affirmative human capital investment. Because it's good and fine to open the private sector if you don't have the young people who have the capacity and the education that would allow them to, you know, bring talent that is relevant, you know, to new industries, then we have a problem. So this is why, you know, having the whole discussion about education, about health, about social protection is also extremely important for the years to come. And I'm happy to see that in a country like Morocco, for instance, we see a number of, you know, top-notch universities coming to life and proposing that kind of a new way of going about the human capital development. It's important, and it's important to try to see in other countries, in other parts of this Middle East and North Africa region, you know, more of that, because that's the only way to stabilize the region, to stabilize this huge threat that is migration, and notably migration up north, and to stabilize, you know, the countries in terms of their own, you know, security arrangements.
Well, it's quite a challenge. But again, no, but it's, we'll talk about it at the end, this is at the end, but it's about taking responsibility. And to mount that, I'm coming to you on taking responsibility, because circling back to Europe, there's a strong debate in some corners that European countries should deliver stronger support to Ukraine for its war efforts against Russian invasion. Others say it should be more cautious. What should be done, and more realistically, what could be done?
First of all, I must say that, you know, I spent approximately 20 years of my professional life to establish contacts with Russia, with Ukraine, with Belarus, with these countries in Caucasus, in Central Asia. So I am personally very worried, you know, by this situation. But I have absolutely no hesitation in the analysis. And it's a way for me maybe to respond to the initial session, because in my opinion, you know, Russia is doing a colonial war under nuclear protection in Ukraine. And I know that this wording can be seen as inappropriate, you know, outside Europe, but to work since a very long time, as I said, you know, on Russia, I'm very struck by this idea, you know, that Russia could be seen as a sort of leading of the so-called global south. It's completely misleading about what is happening right now in Ukraine. This country is methodically destroyed by the Russians. We can speak for a while, you know, about the motivations, the origin of this war, but the key point is, first of all, for Ukrainians. Ukraine has no more security, and civilians are targeted, their infrastructure are clearly targeted. And Ambassador Lucchini said something very important in the initial session. He said, you know, the plateau questions, who guards the guards? And the fact that we have a United Nations security member which used nuclear rhetoric against a country without nuclear weapons is a turning point. And that's bad news for all of us, whatever we think, you know, about this war. So that's my first point to respond to your question. Now, question for Europeans. Is there security more guarantee with Ukraine destroyed by Russia and Russia as a winner? I don't think so.
Yep.
What would have been the attitude of Europeans without a US military support given to Ukraine? I'm afraid of saying that they would have observed certainly the situation. So the main consequence, and it can be also as deep political consequences, but the main consequences are first for Europe to have lost its main competitive advantage on the global scene, which has to be stable and at peace. So it's now belonging to the past. And second, it creates a new transatlantic strengthening relation, which are visible, you know, in military terms. Enlargement of NATO to Sweden and Finland, for instance. In financial terms, because all the sanctions, you know, are the continuation of the sanctions taken, you know, after 11 September, in a sense, in terms of methodology, even if the magnitude is higher than ever. Russia is now the most sanctioned country in the world before Iran or North Korea. And Russia is not Serbia in terms of its importance in globalization. Third, in technological terms, and last but not least, in energy terms. I mean, Europe is obliged to transform its energy model very quickly, very deeply, because it took, you know, gas from Russia through lands since 4 decades, and now is obliged to reverse the flow, to take more gas from the south, but more importantly, from the US, of course, but from Norway and from the UK. So it's a dramatic change, it's very challenging, and it has consequences, namely for Europeans, obviously, but elsewhere. Have a look about, you know, the food security situation, and on that, maybe we should congratulate what was done, you know, by the Antonio Guterres from the United Nations to try to stop the blocus of the Black Sea, to allow, you know, the export of grains. There is an interesting figure to have in mind. You know, in 2010, Russia plus Ukraine was around 10% of the global grain exportation. Before the war in February, the restarting of the war in February 2022, it was almost 30%. So it's a problem for all of us. And last point, I fully agree with what you have said about, you know, the need to redesign the multilateral system. The problem is that we have now a multipolar system without multilateralism. And the problem is that we have a United Nations Security Council which is blocked since the war in Syria by Russia.
Thank you, Thomas. Andres, I saw you itching there. No, but I mean, Thomas made a very good point about food security, which, as being in Africa now, it has a real impact. And circling back to Latin America for a second, you mentioned the recent crisis in Peru. There was a momentous election in Brazil. Venezuela and the US now are, let's call them pseudo-friends again because of the energy crisis, spurred by the war in Ukraine. And from January, most Latin American countries will be ruled by, let's say, left-wing governments of different colors, of a big pantone of colors. But will a region that is an agricultural superpower step up and provide food to the world after a Russian invasion of Ukraine? You think?
No. You know, I don't know, perhaps it's like the Cuban Missile Crisis, perhaps it's a question of age. Human suffering is terrible. And you see it every day. You see it in the news. You read about it. The famines in Somalia, in Ethiopia, the migrants who are trying to get to a better life in Europe and in the United States. I think that at the end of the day, it's extremely difficult to look at these issues that you mentioned regarding the need to recalibrate and restructure both a multilateral system and leadership and all of that. I think it's true. We live in a period in which we probably have the least respectable political leadership around the world that we have ever had. I grew up with, admiring political leaders around the world, either for the terrible things they were doing or the very good things that they were doing. Today, I think it's very difficult for young people to identify with political leadership. And that's why they are angry. And that's why they would like to see change. And that's why in countries like Brazil, like Mexico, like Peru, and Chile, and Colombia, they are voting for change. They're looking to give another political party or another individual potential leader the option of taking over government. However, from what we know from the past, those desires for change, at the end of the day, very often are frustrated. Yeah. And people look back and say, I voted for Mr. Bolsonaro, or I voted for Mr. López Obrador, or I voted for Mr. Petro, but they didn't change fundamentally the basic problems that we face. So, I go back to what keeps me awake, if anything, at night. And I think the one thing that worries me the most, doesn't keep me awake, but it worries me the most, is that the younger generation, the generation of so we say the 18s to the 30s, late 20s, although they spend a lot of time criticizing, and although they go out to the streets and they vote with passion on issues like climate change and so on, they do not seem, at least from my perspective, to bring more solutions than the previous generations tried to bring. So we'll have to see. Going to the Ukraine issue, and this morning we heard from the panelists about Ukraine, and I think that this is a war of attrition. It's a war that's probably going to go on for quite some time. We read and hear every morning about the number of people who died, civilians. And at the end of the day, very little is being done other than sanctions and speeches and ability to try to change things, as we say in Spanish, por la buena. And that's not working. The Ukraine crisis gets worse every day, and more people die, and really one looks back and says, is there no way to stop Mr. Putin and to stop Russia from doing what it's doing? And you put oil price caps and you put sanctions, but none of those have really changed the underlying situation as it applies to the Ukrainians. And in some countries, the US, for example, in a political transition that is probably going to take place in the next 2 years. In the UK, there is now already Ukraine fatigue. People are questioning how long, for how much are they going to pay to keep Ukraine alive. And of course, in any war of attrition, and that holds true for the Middle East conflict, it holds true for conflicts in Africa or even in Latin America. There comes a time when people say, this is it. I mean, we're not going to do all of what we have been doing. That worries me.
Well, you're rightly so. And I remember when I left Ukraine after a few weeks in April, I left with that feeling, this is going to turn into a war of attrition, and I may have to come back because we're going to be here for the long run. But let me stop right here for a second, go broader and ask all of you in the audience, using your funky app, in one word, because we were talking about redesigning the system, how can Africa, Latin America, Europe, and the US work closer together to face the challenges we just discussed? And if I'm not mistaken, if the God of technology works, we should have the words somewhere here.
Where do we find this on the app?
Well, it's for them to vote.
Oh, just for them?
Yes.
We're not allowed to do it.
No, yeah, I'm going to ask you that
right.
now.
That's all right.
So
I don't mind.
you have the stage.
Can you read?
Plus ou moins.
Tu veux, je t'aide?
Non, non, ça va.
Commitment, principled,
Climate,
solidarity, respect, transparency, listening, Atlantic dialogues, obviously. Thank you, Karim, for the invitation and for the discussion. Digitization, listening. I think that's a key one. And before opening the floor for questions from the audience to keep building on these issues, 2 minutes to all of you, Obi, Fred, Thomas, and Andres. Obi, you launched a grenade about redesigning the system. A penny for your thoughts. How can we do that?
I think that, unlike my colleague, who is engaged in an intergenerational war, I vote for an intergenerational dialogue. You know,
But there's one thing you have to recognize. 3 years ago, we did the same exercise, and the same words came out. So in 3 years, nothing much has changed.
the young ones are not to blame. I'm sorry. You know, we need to be accountable. We need to be accountable. What's the average age of those running global institutions? Certainly not the age of the emerging leaders here at the dialogue. That's not their age. What's the average age of those governing countries? It's not these ones that are here. So I'm in fact saying that you stopped on a note where you said that you haven't seen that the younger ones have better solutions than the older generation. That's not true. I mean, a lot of the innovations we're seeing today is actually coming from the young ones. So in many ways, I think that those who wrote listening were very, very on point. We became a world that does not listen. The disabled is crying in our midst, we don't listen. The women are crying and saying, what kind of a world would we have where it would take about 140 years to get to equality? We're not listening. The young people are saying we're excluded. We don't listen. And guess what? It's mostly you, the men, that are not listening. Because you're mostly the ones sitting in boardrooms, you're mostly the ones sitting in government houses, you're mostly the ones leading organizations. So we do want a world that would redesign on the basis of leveraging our diversities. The diversity and an effective management of it, if we managed it well, if we took a redesign approach that looks at the world not from the lens that it has always been looked at. The world looked a particular way, but the world has changed radically. And yet, the basis of decisions concerning this changed world remains the way that it was for you during the Cuba missile. It's a world apart. So I believe that, look, when we come to dialogues like this, nobody is going to pay us for not being bold. And nobody is going to cane us for being bold. These kinds of platforms should enable us push ourselves to the point where we have radical new ideas that we could try. This safe ground of being respectable and just being polite about problems because they are not touching us, I don't think it's a good one. It really isn't a good one. We're being unfair to those outside of the privilege that we have enjoyed. Picking on what my dear friend said about human capital development, do you all know that in our world today, 7 out of every 10 children are not achieving basic literacy and numeracy skills? SDG 4, but then what? SDG 4, get more children in school, but 7 out of every 10 of them are not achieving basic foundational literacy and numeracy skills. This has an implication for the productivity of our world. It has an implication for growth. It has an implication for tackling inequality. It has an implication for so many of the things that are pet projects. But we're not seeing how this interconnectedness must push us in the direction of bold ideas. I would, people sort of say, okay, when you say redesign the multilateral system, what do you specifically mean? I would say that we grandfather the World Bank, the IMF, the UN system, and we just give to these emerging new minds about how development happens on the basis of your social contract theory, and sort of say, what does the world you want to see 20 years from now? If you and I are still here, praise God. But
Not me. You, yes, not me.
But say to them, here's the chart, design it. What someone asked me, what would you have done today, as at that time you were Minister of Education, if it were today? And I said, I would actually get the approval of my principal, the president, and say, permit me to shut down the Ministry of Education. And then I would get that permission, and I would invite all these young, crazy ones and say to them, design the education that you want to see take you to the next 2 decades. You'll be shocked at the level of creativity that would be on the table. I think we're sitting on gold mine, but we're not allowing the expression of that gold mine through our young people. So my final note, because it concerns Africa, in all of this that I've said, I have great confidence for my continent. There are 3 game changers for my continent: the young people, the women, and technology. These 3 things will surprise the world when it comes to Africa. And I believe that even though the data is dismal right now, by the year 2030, year of the SDGs, Africa would be the continent, based on current estimate, that would still have more than 90%, that would have more than 90% of the world's poor. But it could get in a different, it could flip in a different direction. And these 3 game changers are the things that I am absolutely trusting will flip Africa in that direction. And that gives me a lot of hope every day. That's the only basis on which I can sleep at all.
Thank you, Ovi. Andres was listening, so.
Very quickly, Obiageli, I don't think we have either an intergenerational conflict or even a difference of opinion.
Okay.
I agree with almost everything you have said. And I think that not only because it's valid for Africa, it's equally valid everywhere in the whole world. Entrepreneurship by young people, technological invention, all of that I think is perfectly reasonable as a way of looking forward optimistically. The one thing that I wanted to point out was that as you go through these exercises of these dialogues, we tend, because that's, and I was pointing to the words that came out, I remember very well the same exercise the last time we met here in Marrakesh. Accountability, climate change, confidence, these were the words that came out then, and they're the words that come out today. That doesn't mean that we haven't made progress. It just means that we still are facing the same set of problems and the same set of worries in terms of what is required in this dialogue that we are engaged in. And I come from a region where, unfortunately, today, our moderator talked about most of the region being somewhere in some pink tide of leftist leadership. But things are going badly for the region. They're not doing any better. We have a president of Colombia and a president of Chile who are in their 30s. I mean, they are young. You mentioned there are no political leaders other than us gray, white-haired individuals. But there are, and many of them are facing exactly the same problems that their predecessors faced, or worse. So I wanted to clarify that. It's not that we disagree, it's just that I wanted to point out that we do have continuing issues that we still have not been able to resolve, neither my generation nor yours, nor any of the younger ones.
No, I am going to be 60 next year. I don't belong to the younger.
Well, I'm going to be 80, so that's
Wow.
a bigger gap.
Thank you. Thomas, Farid, okay, are we listening? And what can we listen then? Better?
Sorry?
How can we listen better then?
Oh,
Looking ahead.
well, first of all, I'm coming from a country which elected a president who was 37 years old. I don't know if it's good or if it's bad in terms of his policy, to be honest. So I take your point, in terms of inclusion, of course, but maybe what you have said seems to me a little bit slightly, allow me to say that, demagogic. Because in our organization, for instance, we are very, very pressure for all the things you have asked. The gender balance, the generational gap, things like that. And it's positive. So it's on the way. I mean, we are working very, very seriously on that. So to be said that it's not down, certainly it's not down as quickly as it should be down. I take your points. But take, please, into consideration the fact that we are working very seriously on that.
Thank you, Thomas.
That's
Merci,
reassuring.
Well, that's why we're having a dialogue. Thomas and Farid?
Yeah, look, a couple of points. One is that I really believe that evolution and development is not instant coffee. It takes time. It's, I would say, Turkish coffee. You need to wait till just a little bit to have it. So it tastes good. So the whole discussion about revolution for me is, raises alarm bells. I saw it in my own country. The place is falling apart because bright people thought that we need to change everything in one shot. Not good. Evolution, bold evolution. Building on youth, absolutely right. Building on education, building on health and social protection. You mentioned, that terrible number of, the learning poverty that we have in all of our countries, in Africa, in the Middle East, etc. Young people, if you compare a young kid in Singapore, after 13 years of learning, they learn worth of 13 years. in our region, they learn worth of 6.5 or 7 years. You add to it stunting. How can you have a country, how can you have a people who can be performing if they are stunted at birth because they don't have the necessary health and coverage? So these are very, very important issues that we need to be really very much aware of. In addition to that, my penultimate point is that the role of the state there has proven over the years to be a negative one. They are not doing the right thing. They're spending tons of money on education, but badly. If you look at the outcomes of the scores, terrible, terrible. And last but not least, going back to the politicians, what we see happening today is a level of irresponsibility when it comes to our politicians, and that's an issue. That's an issue. So voice, openness of the political system, openness of the economic system are absolutely fundamental. And that's the only way to go. Otherwise, we'll keep running around and in circles. And 20 years from now, we meet here. If God, give us life. And we'll have exactly the same issues there.
Thank you, Farid. We have time for just one question from the audience. If people in the organization can source us one.
You have to take two. I mean, you can.
Well, it depends on the taker. I think they felt it soon. Did they feed it through the app? Or should I just take, somebody wants to take the mic? Mike, yeah.
Now, Marcus Freitas from Brazil. My question is this. I heard the comments and all that, but I think there is a fundamental issue that is not getting addressed, which is how do we fix democracies to produce good leadership? Because that's the challenge that we have at the end of the day. When the elector goes and votes, how do we guarantee that the people that are getting elected are really capable of facing the challenges that you just mentioned? So my question is this. One, how do you fix it? And second, if you're going to choose one leader in the world nowadays who you consider that is doing a good job, who would you choose?
Oh, that's a hot potato. Any takers?
Well, on the question on how are we going to fix this matter of quality of leaders, I actually was upset enough about it, I decided to do something about it. So I established, between the time you last saw me at the dialogue and now, we established what we call the School of Politics, Policy and Governance. And we basically have designed the customized leader, the kinds of leaders that I would go to vote for. So we're raising them. We've produced a cohort of class of 2021. We've produced a cohort of class of 2022. And the cohort of class of 2023 are in class. And guess what? It's an average age of about 32. And guess what? Class of 2021, there were 160 of them. Class of 2022, we've produced 133 of them. We currently have 234 in class for class of 2023. You know the important thing? What we designed is working. In the primaries of political parties in my country, which happened some 2 months ago, 55 of our students aspired to be candidates of political parties, and 8 of them got the ticket. And so they are going to run in the elections in February. You have to do something. You have to basically say to yourself, we have a leadership crisis on our hands. And if we're going to fix it, then we have to design the kind of leaders that should govern us. The public space is in trouble. It's not like the private space is any better, because, gosh, the CEOs have been up to their own shenanigans too. But the public space, when it fails, really affects the most vulnerable amongst us. That's why this design of the school as a response And it's based on real research that showed that democracy is in serious crisis because what we have is no longer democracy. It is what I call monopoly democracies, an aberration.
I thought you were going to say you were going to run for president. Andres,
I ran already.
quickly, I know. Say again.
I would make a suggestion to the organizers of this conference in order to answer your question. And that is, we have a cohort of emerging young leaders attending this conference. I think we should sit them down and ask them the same two questions. How do you make sure that democracy works for the good? I don't think it can necessarily. It sometimes does, it sometimes doesn't. And who they look up to as their number one leader. I think that would be something interesting to
Karim, take note for the last session.
have that done.
Thomas, quickly, we run out of time, but just fun.
Very quickly, there is something which should be in terms of education, in terms of training, to participate in election when you are living in a country where there are regular elections, which is the first way to describe a democratic system. There is a second way, which is to be very careful about separation of powers and to explain this separation of power to young citizens. And to respond to your question about, who can be seen, as a leader right now, for me, clearly this year it is President Zelensky.
Farid, 30 seconds.
I'll be very serious. The leader I see today is the best, what I admire the most, is the coach of the Moroccan soccer team.
Good conclusion.
You just got your dinner served.
Timely. Obi, Farid, Thomas, Andres, thank you very much for a very illuminating and lively discussion. And a great British comedian, Albert Finney, used to say that the secret to riches is the same as the secret to comedy, and that is timing. Hopefully, this is finally the timing for politicians to take responsibility. Thank you very much, and thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we'll now take a coffee break and reconvene at 4:45. Thank you.